Welcome, everybody. I'm Demetrius Nealon. I'm the product manager at Microsoft for WinGet, the Windows Package Manager. And I'm really excited to be here. This is my first trip to Prague, and it's my second PowerShell conference. I spoke at the one in Bellevue a couple of months ago. And when I was contacted about speaking here, I was experiencing some pretty heavy imposter syndrome. I had not done a whole lot with PowerShell. Many of you probably know a lot more than I do. And we'll go through a little bit of what's been going on with WinGet and how we started out with building this client using C++. Originally, we were targeting Nano Server, and there was no PowerShell there, so we didn't think that that was something we needed to do. That decision predated me by a little bit, but as the product owner, I still took it as my responsibility. So we ended up going down a journey. We had an issue that was created that was essentially an ask for native PowerShell support. And we realized we had some heavy lifting to do there. So we've developed a COM API, and we started doing a lot of refactoring work so that the CLI calls this COM API. We've done some integration with the Microsoft Store, with Intune, with Xbox, and a few other teams so that everyone has equal access to the code underneath. And we have a simple UWP application in the open source repository at GitHub that provides an example. And if you saw any of the announcements at Microsoft Build regarding DevHome, you'll also be able to go look and see how that's calling the COM interfaces as well. We've had a lot of other things that have been changing, like requests for access through system context or the ability to remotely call and manage WinGet, and we're working on all of those things. And when I was asked to do this session, I knew we were going to be doing the configuration management side of things. So a lot of the work around DSC had been discussed and there was a public issue, but we weren't really making a lot of noise about it because we knew this was going to be pretty big and pretty exciting. So I covered a little bit about why we didn't start with PowerShell and where are we now. A lot of people want to know where we're going. What we're seeing today is there's a couple of million people that are using the CLI-based experience, and an order of magnitude more through APIs and other interfaces. But it was really designed for people to go in and do direct package management. So I think there's a lot of improvements there. And a lot of our challenge is the impedance mismatch between the nouns and verbs that you use in the native Windows C++ CLI and what you would expect out of PowerShell commandlets and the syntax there. So one of the big asks I would have right off the bat is come to the GitHub repository, give us a lot of feedback. We don't know exactly which verbs and nouns make the most sense here. I can pick on package pinning as an initial one. We thought about set WinGet package pin or something like that. We thought about limit WinGet package. And that sounded really good until you start wanting to know what is the opposite of a limit. So there's a lot of interesting things that are there. We have a lot of alias that we've thought about and been looking to build, and we really want you to tell us what you want so that we're not wasting our time building something you're going to be unhappy with. Now, I had a lot of work done ahead of time to prep for different demos that have been done in the last couple of months. We did an early preview for the MVP Summit that I would say is very alpha for the configuration work. I spoke at Build about a lot of the configuration management aspects, and I think some of you have given me the feedback that you'd like a little more detail in how to build those declarative configuration files. And I spoke a little bit about the PowerShell modules that we released on the PowerShell gallery over the last couple of months as well. But I wanted to give you an opportunity to sort of give me some feedback today. So we've got 5 different topics here. If you want topic number 1, you want to go more into the client and the functionality, raise of hand. Okay. If you're interested in the community repository and what we do in terms of validating the packages being submitted. Okay. WinGet create versus YAML create, if you know what those are. Those are both tools designed to help you generate a manifest. WinGet Create is a CI/CD tool that you can use. It'll also help with generating the pull request. So if you're producing a package, you can just automate with that with a GitHub action. And YAML Create is a PowerShell-based module that's community maintained for downloading an application, parsing it to figure out what kind of a package it is and helping you to generate the manifest for that one. Next is the PowerShell modules. Raise of hands on that one. And WinGet configuration. All right, so it's definitely the last two. All right, so PowerShell modules. We've started out with a process of trying to figure out how to refactor the COM APIs into PowerShell modules. And we started out with Crescendo as a hackathon. And there was just so much difference between what we had in the CLI syntax and what you would expect as JSON formatted output that it just didn't get us very far. I think the last one that we have that's still a Crescendo-based commandlet is around getting and setting sources so that you can do things like add an enterprise source or remove the Microsoft Store or the community repository. And we started looking at across the entire product and breaking it down into a series of modules. One of the first ones that we've been doing some work on is the DSC module. So all of these start with Microsoft.WinGet, and then they're broken down into the different areas. So the idea is we're trying to be a little bit logical in terms of what they're doing, and we will have a top-level Microsoft.WinGet that pulls all of them together for you so that you only have to do this one time. We have been looking very differently at how we do some of the things in the CLI and what makes sense from PowerShell. So in the CLI, you have the WinGet upgrade -- all, but there's no equivalent to that in PowerShell. And we don't really know what the best idiom is in this case. So today, if you just say upgrade or update WinGet package, it's going to tell you how many packages you have. It will tell you how many could be upgraded that we know about. And then it's just going to throw an exception. So definitely not in a great state. You'll notice that the client module is not listed as pre-release. That's because we couldn't take a dependency on a pre-release package. So the DSC module wants to pull in the WinGet client. So we put notes on there to mark it to let you know that it's going to be in that preview state. So the first alpha client went out just a few weeks ago. We've done several different releases since then. Having fun with zooming in for you. So you'll see that we've got it marked as not a pre-release, but it should be treated as pre-release. I would like to be able to be in a situation where we can GA this next year at build. I think a lot of the gaps here are getting parity with the existing commands and functions that we have in the CLI. The other thing is really dealing with the differences between Windows PowerShell and PowerShell 7. When we start looking at the configuration bits, we ended up going with PowerShell hosting and bringing that along with us. We also bring .NET along with us because we had a lot of other challenges making sure that the binary assemblies were in the right places. So we went from probably 25 megs to about 225 megs in the last version. You're going to see something subtle coming out likely in the next release where we will install ourselves essentially as a stub package. So you'll have those basic install, upgrade, uninstall, but you won't have configuration from the CLI. We will essentially bootstrap ourselves. Then we'll pull the larger assemblies down from the store afterwards. That way we have a smaller footprint for Windows 11. We're very restricted on how much we can add in the OS builds, and we're very restrictive on what can be there at the very beginning when you log in. And I know for myself, it doesn't matter whether it's the CLI or whether it's the PowerShell module. I would love to be able to do a fresh install of Windows 11 and on first login, just be able to run install WinGet package or WinGet install. And I think a lot of you would like that as well. If that's the case, definitely give us that feedback so that we can use that as data to go back and justify that work. Any other questions on PowerShell modules or what we're doing there?
Revert the WinGet binary to PowerShell. Do you completely rewrite it to be a separate PowerShell concept, or do you wrap around WinGet?
So the question is, when we're looking at PowerShell, are we wrapping the existing CLI binary, or are we doing something completely different? We're doing something completely different. We started out with just a C++ code base that everything was native and the CLI was calling it. And what we ended up doing, because we're delivered inside of an MSIX package that runs in a container, there's a virtual registry, so we don't have access to the real registry. And there's also a virtual file system. So we needed to first give ourselves access to the real Windows registry and the real file system to be able to run these installers, to be able to install portable packages. And in order to do that, we decided to expose a COM API. So what we've done is we've generally refactored the original code base into a COM API, and then we've had the CLI call into that. We give PowerShell the exact same access to call into that. And anybody that wants to integrate with WinGet also has that same thing. So it's been, I would say, a very major refactoring to redesign how the core works as a COM service and how PowerShell can access that through an API. And we can actually see the difference between the CLI calling us, between PowerShell calling us, and anybody else that's integrating to help us understand where we've got problems and where to improve. That answer your question? Awesome. Any other questions on PowerShell commandlets in general? Okay, we'll go into configuration then. One of the big things I wanted to do early on at Microsoft was get into configuration management. I'd spent about a third of my career on Mac, about a third of it on Linux and Unix, and a third of it on Windows. And I have felt the same pain that everybody else has with how brutal it is to get your environment set up, get your project configured, or even just get your machine to the point where you're happy with it. And one of the big dependencies there was having a solid package manager. So couldn't even begin to work on configuration management until WinGet existed and had a decent amount of packages in it and decent reliability. I don't think we're anywhere near done with WinGet, and I think the next big feature that we needed for this is coming out in 1.5 at the end of the month, which is the package pinning behavior, so that you can tell WinGet you don't want something to be upgraded beyond a certain version or a certain range of versions. Because when we get into the DSC world and we start wanting to install different versions of dependencies, and you have different projects that might have conflicting dependencies, we needed a way for the package manager to at least say, don't do that, to cause it to fail and make sure that we're doing the right things from the configuration side. We talked quite a bit internally about whether or not we should build something new and build a completely new tool chain around this, or whether we should invest in something that exists already. I was a big proponent of going ahead and making the big bet on PowerShell DSC and essentially making sure we're reinvesting in that community and partnering with the PowerShell team on making sure that we're all aligned on that same North Star vision. And for the last few months, I've been meeting with several other teams like DevDiv, that's known for Visual Studio Code, and .NET, and all of the work they're doing with Microsoft DevBox. I've been meeting with the Xbox gaming team that has a lot of interesting challenges around installing Unity for game developers and GDK. We've been meeting with Intune, who is looking more at a push model than a pull model, where rather than just pushing applications down to a machine, they want to be able to actually push more configuration data, and they want to be able to give some of their users the ability to have a pull model where they can pull that down. So there's been a lot of work done to enable private repositories, so you could think of an air-gapped environment or a highly regulated industry that has supply chain concerns, so that you can guarantee where these modules are coming from, where the packages are coming from, and you've got that end-to-end solution in place. And then we start looking at the future. I want to be able to just run a single command, and I want to be able to essentially back up my entire Windows configuration. I want to know all the applications I have installed. I want to know how they're configured. I want to be able to get my PowerShell profile. I want to be able to have all of my settings and all of my preferences exported and be able to go to another machine. So I know there's been work out there on reverse DSC, and we're looking at what I would say is probably vNext for that. If you look at something large and complex like IIS or SQL Server, I don't think we all want to slurp down 1,000 plus properties or setting into one of these configuration files. So I think we need something smarter that not only will let me do the logical equivalent of get star from a DSC resource, but I want to be able to get any deltas from a default state. And I don't know if anybody's done a lot of work in this area, but would love to talk to you if you have, so we can try to figure out the right path forward. We've also started getting the first few bug reports coming in from the WinGet configuration. And typically it's things like a user calling the file resource, the variables aren't being honored. And I think that's probably just a bug in our end on not passing the correct escape sequences. And then we've had some others where invoke DSC resource doesn't actually work correctly. And what we did was, rather than building on PowerShell DSC v3, we went ahead with v2 since it's stable. And we worked with the PowerShell team to make invoke DSC a stable commandlet that we can call from there. So we're really pulling everything along with us, and we're using v2. Where we're going, we're looking at v3, and we're looking at hopefully making the resources a little bit smarter and making it where we can pull those in. I also, just a couple of days ago, got my hand on some of the first implementations of calling the DSC configuration in PowerShell. You'll be pleased to know you have two of them. You have start configuration and invoke configuration. So you'll have both a synchronous and an asynchronous way to call the configuration. Any other questions about anything I brought up so far? Yes.
Like package version pinning in PC or WinGet, are you also considering that some applications or many applications actually do like auto updating themselves? So could you implement this more?
So the question is about pinning and how we deal with packages that upgrade themselves. This is a very tricky area. We know that we can logically pin a package in WinGet, and we can prevent WinGet from going in and updating it, but we can't prevent the user from going and updating it, and we can't necessarily prevent the application from updating itself. So in some cases, there may be nothing we can do other than add some sort of metadata or decoration to the manifest that gives us a hint and lets us know that that could happen. And for many of them, we already have this in place. If you look at the manifest for Visual Studio Code as an example, you'll see that it requires an explicit upgrade, which is a hint that we are not doing upgrades or updates from WinGet itself directly, and we're expecting that Visual Studio is going to be doing that to us. When it comes to some of the applications, upgrades don't report that metadata to the control panel as well. And that's an even trickier situation where we think that the application is on an older version. It's actually been automatically updating itself and just not reporting it. I think the biggest thing there is to work together as a community, reach back to those publishers and ask them to address that concern in their installer packages or in their updater packages. And if we need to go in and add metadata to indicate the relative health or quality or whatever types of metrics you're looking for, I'm very open to doing that, but I do want to be careful that we're not telling any of these ISVs that they have bad installers or that they're providing a bad experience. Because at the end of the day, in most cases, if you can install their software and run it, the customers are happy and they're happy. So, you know, it's not really Microsoft's position to go out and tell everybody how to build software, but I can tell you how to work well with WinGet, and I can recommend better practices around building installers regardless of the technology you're doing that in. But really, as IT professionals that are representing enterprise organizations, you have a lot more weight than we do to be able to let a publisher know that if they don't update their software, that you're not going to continue using it or that you're going to look for an alternative. That'll carry a lot more weight with them than just Microsoft saying, we have a lovely Ivy Tower that we'd love everybody to climb on board with us. Any other questions? Yes.
We are planning to use it with Intune, and we would like to non-admin users to not be able to use the WinGet CLI or PowerShell command. Is that possible, or is it planned?
So question is related to enterprise management and looking at Intune to drive configuration. And the concern is whether or not the WinGet client and the PowerShell can be restricted so that users cannot use it. The current state of the application and the group policy is that it's an all or nothing. Either you have WinGet enabled, and that means the COM API, the CLI, and the PowerShell commandlets, or nothing. We are building new policies. We're going to split out the CLI experience from the COM API. We'll make sure that PowerShell honors the CLI piece of this interface. We will then go in and add most likely some sort of an allow list for those authenticated callers, because just because we build a COM interface and in Intune you restrict it to that, that doesn't mean somebody else or some other application doesn't have the ability to make that call to that COM interface. And I'm expecting that work will probably be done third quarter this year. September timeframe is what we're shooting for to split that out. I don't know that we'll have the allow list work done in time by then. That is a question? Okay. All right, so any other topics anybody wants me to go into? Otherwise, I'll go back to the choose your own adventure and let you pick the next. Go ahead.
Yeah, maybe updating apps with Intune. Is it planned that these apps update automatically, or will it need manual update, or how does updating apps from the Microsoft Store work?
Okay. So the question is about applications auto updating with WinGet and how that works with the store and doing that in the Intune context. WinGet has no service that's running, so there is no auto update mechanism. Intune has the application called the sidecar that runs on the client. That can call into WinGet and run something like upgrade all, or it can specify individual packages that it wants to upgrade, but we have no auto update mechanism in place. Currently, the Microsoft Store does not expose the version information for WinGet. So you'll see version unknown when you run WinGet list or WinGet upgrade with store applications. And with upgrade, you won't see any of them because we treat the word unknown as a sentinel value for the version. So WinGet's not going to default to that. You have to force those upgrades to happen, and WinGet does support that. We are expecting to get that version information from the Microsoft Store. And then from there, we've been looking at the possibility with DevHome of having a service that would run an auto upgrade on WinGet packages. But we've gotten a lot of very conflicting feedback from customers on whether or not they want WinGet packages automatically upgraded or updated and other restrictions they want to place on them. So certainly without pinning, we don't want to run an auto upgrade scenario. And for those enterprise scenarios, we need to reason about what happens when the user's machine says that they've pinned something to some version and Intune wants to push an upgrade. The odds are we'll have the Intune pushing the upgrade will win, but we'll still be able to inform the user that their pin has been violated. And that concept is really just informational for the user because we know WinGet can't control what the user does or what the application does itself with a self-upgrade. But if they're writing that information to the registry, we can at least inform the user that this application has been upgraded, your PIN has been violated, so that they'll get that as an informational message. But it won't be a proactive notification. It will only be when they run a command like list or upgrade that would pull that metadata through. And if you're looking for a different behavior than that, or you have a better idea, we'd love to get that feedback as well. So how many of you have been using WinGet in the enterprise and had any concerns about validation and security? So a few people have. When we take package submissions from the community at GitHub, we are allowing essentially any user to go in and submit a manifest for anybody's software. We are going to go through and do static analysis on all of the URLs given. We've got policies that are looking at the domains for the websites they're claiming to be submitted from and where the installers come from. We then do static analysis on the actual installer itself, looking for malware detections across multiple antivirus vendors. And then we go a step further into a detonation chamber where we actually run the installer that we've downloaded. We do active scanning with Defender. We do a file watcher to look and see what's happening. And only if all of those things come through satisfactory will we then allow it to get merged into the community repository. We also have additional follow-ups that happen after that. So it's possible something new gets published, some AV vendor decides that there is malware or some potentially unwanted application in place. If we get notified, we'll immediately take it down and go through that process to revalidate again. And we rescan the entire repository. The last time I checked, we were about 4,000 applications, a little over 17,000 different unique installers. And we periodically rescan every single one of those, looking for any other malware or PUA that shows up after the fact, after the original submission happened. And in the last 3.5 years, I can think of 4 incidents. There was one that I would say was a true case where if you were in a particular locale, the installer actually streamed down some bundle software, and that wasn't a case that we had been testing for. That one was pulled down that day, and unfortunately it hasn't been fixed, so it's not allowed back in. We've had a couple of false detections. We had one with a version of Docker Desktop. Recently, we had another one. Unfortunately, I can't remember the name of the software, but a day after we had passed our scans, there was a 0-day detection from a partner, so we removed it. And then a few days later, after an appeal, it was decided that it was, again, a false positive detection, so we're then able to allow that package to come back in. The same detonation that we're using is also being leveraged by the Microsoft Store and many other teams at Microsoft. So it is many of the same things that you would expect out of Microsoft for safety and security, but I will still say zero trust. There's still a chance that something is going to get in, that the software is going to be either containing something that you're not going to want or that you're not going to be consistent about what the software bill of materials is. So if you have those supply chain concerns, do your own testing, do your own validation, and go from that point. I think the next topic that I had in here was the WinGet create versus YAML create. A lot of these were optimized around how can we make it easier for people to build a manifest and submit that to the community repository, and how to make it easier for you to keep applications current using just an update type of a syntax and pulling these into CI/CD scenarios. We've seen a lot of integrations with Azure DevOps. We've seen them with GitHub. I haven't really heard too many requests from anything else, but I think the other big area to look at is how you could use the community repository or the Microsoft Store as an upstream provider so that you could then pull those manifests and the installers down and then put them into your own environment, whether that's just an enterprise repository so that you can manage what applications are available there, or even for an air-gapped scenario where you need to do additional validations and pull both the installer and the manifest through to get it into an air-gapped scenario. It's fairly easy to do this with a local manifest file, but there's still some challenges there with Microsoft Store applications. If you're trying to install them in an offline disconnected mode, you also need that license file. And the store takes care of a lot of dependencies for you. So when you go to download one of these applications from the store, you'll need to download all of the dependencies as well as the license file. And then we want to give you a similar mechanism so that you can use WinGet to install them. All right, so I've gone through a bunch of different content here. I wanted to make sure that you had plenty of time for other questions. Anybody have any other topics that they want me to cover? Yes. Windows Server. So right now, WinGet is not available on Windows Server. We have seen it work on Server 2019. If you know how to directly call the executable, the app execution alias that we use or the junction that we use is not available on Server 2019. We know that everything works well on Server 22. The main gap with Server 22 is it doesn't ship with the Microsoft Store. So you don't have a way to distribute the app installer on Windows Server 22. A lot of the work that we've done with the DSC resource with that module has been really looking at making it easier to install on server so that you can run that same PowerShell script or use that DSC resource to get all of the dependencies that you need and the version of WinGet that you want to have on server. I'm expecting once we get the UI XAML installer situation a little bit in better shape the way we like it, I think we'll expect that'll be the first point where we'll start recommending that as an option for installing it. And then in terms of an official support position, it's still going to be open source, but we want to make sure we have everything documented, and we're getting a lot of community feedback on that now. And the expectation is then once you have it on Windows Server, you can either manage your own upgrades through the private REST source, or you can go ahead and use the store services that are still available so that you can still call the REST endpoint and get those packages so that you can use it. And we've gotten a lot of feedback from Windows Server users and the community. It did take a while for us to pull everything together for the business case to justify that extra level of investment to support server. I think we finally have enough information and everybody is agreed and aligned on how we want to do this going forward. I don't know if we'll actually change the position on declaring it just as experimental on 22, but I see that many of you are already doing this, and it's really just a matter of wanting to make sure that we're not breaking some functionality or doing something that's going to make another breaking change happen. Again, let us know if we're missing your use case or if anything is going on there. I recently found out the same situation is happening on Windows IoT. So we're looking at Windows IoT, and I just created the GitHub issue for that a few days ago based on somebody saying it didn't work on Windows IoT. If it's the exact same situation as Windows Server, where it's just the dependencies for the VC redistributable and UI XAML, then I think we'll be able to say it's experimental on IoT. And hopefully the DSC path will be that thing that unblocks us to be able to get into that SKU as well. We did design a target framework metadata property for packages so that you can actually specify Windows Desktop. I expect we'll need to do that for Windows Server. I have gotten reports where some software doesn't work on desktop or some software doesn't work on server. So we'll have to go through and reason with that and get that through a full iteration. And anytime we adjust the schema, it's about a 90-day process for us to take the code in the client, push that back through the validation infrastructure, and then cycle it back out to the GitHub APIs on the front end where validation happens. We didn't want to have multiple different code bases that were doing all of this validation, so we build all of it in the client. Again, all of it is open source. You can see the NuGet packages that we ship that we use to do validation. So if you want to do custom validation in the enterprise, it's easy to extend that and take advantage of what we've already done with file watchers and AV scanning and pulling the metadata out of the registry that we get when something is installed. Any other questions? Well, super easy crowd. I was expecting some really tough questions. There we go.
What is the pros of using WinGet instead of like
Sure. So the question is, what is my view on why I would use WinGet versus Chocolatey or Scoop or some other package manager? And I will tell you, my goal at Microsoft is not build the package manager and get everybody converted to using it. My goal is simply just make it easier to use Windows and make it better for developers. If Chocolatey meets your needs because they're providing the artifact repository where you can have the binaries to distribute, or the pre and post setup actions that you get with the PowerShell scripts are doing something necessary for you, use that. The main thing that we're looking at with WinGet and building a native package manager was really all about a declarative format for the manifest, not running any scripts or any other arbitrary code. And a lot of that is really just about our stance on security and how we handle things. That does not mean that some other package manager is not secure. It's just a different approach. If you look at Scoop and what they've implemented with the shims, it's a very convenient way to pull portable applications down. It negates the need to approve authentication for UAC, and it makes it very convenient to have a collection of loose applications. If that meets your needs, then use that by all means. We just knew that a lot of enterprises wanted a native solution, and we knew that before we could go out with configuration management, we basically had to have our own package manager that we could reason about and make sure that we're in control of that development cycle and the versioning. Because if we were to depend on a third-party solution, it's possible they could make changes that we either couldn't recover from or that we couldn't quickly adopt and adapt with. But everything we've done has been in the open. So if they wanted to wire up to our repositories and leverage the package metadata, they totally could. And if they're working for you in the enterprise, then you can use them as they are. With the WinGet configuration, you just need a DSC resource for the package manager, and you can use the existing ones that are there today. We did a lot of research with GitHub and the Octaverse on top programming languages and the top package managers that are being used by third party. So we've already developed one for pip, one for NPM, and one for Node. And we're continuing to look at the others that are in the top 10 to help with configuration. I think the biggest gap that I see in the DSC world right now is there's just not enough resources for the things that you need in a developer environment or in a build environment. So we're trying to figure out what the most important ones are and at least get a reference implementation out there. And the DSC community has been very gracious to allow us to go ahead and put those projects out open source under their umbrella so that we can contribute an initial version of it. Hopefully we'll be able to continue maintaining updates and get that full functional set that we all want. But right now, I think it's very new and not very many people have gone and given it a try. I think the other big gap that we have is how we map the packages that are installed to the DSC resources. I talked earlier about the reverse DSC, and I think what we want to be able to do is enumerate through all of the installed software, have some ability to correlate or map that to an existing DSC resource that understands how to configure it or how to read its configuration, and then do the same thing for all of the Windows surface area, whether that's the wallpaper, what shortcuts you have, or any other values that you may have customized in the registry or something else that you needed. And those are areas that we're actively looking for real-world scenarios. So if you have some of that, be sure to give us feedback. You can reach me on Twitter, or you can email me directly, or just create an issue at GitHub. I'll go through and make sure that we're organizing all of that stuff so that we're covering all of those use cases. It's very early days. We intentionally limited things to very much the local environment that you're running in, but we're already looking at what's next for how we can help you provision a Hyper-V VM, run a configuration in there, or a Windows sandbox that's ephemeral, or a Docker container, or even Azure that's not Microsoft DevBox. You might just have your own subscription and you want to be able to configure an environment in the cloud. We want to be able to enable that scenario. And what we sort of loosely call airplane mode, where you're not connected to Azure, we want you to be able to pull the configuration down from something that you may have in the cloud so that you can get that same configuration running in your local environment, and you have a little bit more reliability there in terms of what's happening. We know there are some fundamental differences between the various SKUs that you'll see on Azure and the ones that you'll see on desktop. So that's another area where we want your feedback on what is really important to do in terms of a backup and restore when it's just logically based on configuration. So the question is, have we ever tried having WinGet as a package manager on Windows, reach out to another package manager to install a package from there? No, we have not directly done that, but yes, with WinGet configuration we have. So I can use a WinGet configuration that's just a YAML file that tells me what DSC resources I need to use, where I can get them and what the properties are. And I can absolutely use WinGet to sort of kick off the beginning of that orchestrated process. And then I can use those other tools to go pull those configurations in. And there is a couple of samples of that for JavaScript-based projects. So in the dev-home repository, there's a samples directory, and we have an AKAMS link. It's dsc.yaml. that points you to those samples, and anybody can check a sample in there as well. And that's what I would recommend for now, so that we, as we build these things up, we have more of them to refer to and to share with. But you'll see an example where WinGet is used to install Node.js so that we can get access to the NPM package manager. Then we will use the resource designed for NPM to install the Grunt CLI. And that is a very practical, real example from one of the most active repositories at GitHub, where we're able to give them a fairly trivial configuration. I think the other big area that we've seen some interest and activity is on Microsoft Learn. There's a lot of learning paths for new tools and new technologies. So JavaScript and C++ and C# and Rust and other languages. We want to build some sample configurations for those, make those all available, and make those learning paths easier to get set up. We've seen a lot of education scenarios, whether it's universities or whether it's enterprise organizations doing training. And this is another area where getting a lab set up can be very frustrating, or you end up spending a lot of time fighting the dependencies on somebody's machine. So that's another scenario that we're looking at. Any other questions? Did anybody find the Easter egg in the experimental settings? So there is an experimental setting and an experimental argument. And if you turn those on and run it, you'll see a lovely ASCII graphic. Did anybody see the previous session where the custom PowerShell progress bars were covered? Have you seen the rainbow progress bar in WinGet? I'll bring that up. That's a fun one. So this was a case where the engineering team did something. I was a little unhappy about it because I thought we had spent a lot of time on it, and ended up being quite lucky that it was an easy implementation. So you didn't see any kind of a progress bar there. That was just the base. So I'm going to reset the source. I'll have to do that in administrator mode. And I would do this in PowerShell, except I know it doesn't work. So I've already got a bug filed on the team to fix that. I bring up the settings. That basically just launches a text file. I'm going to set my progress bar to rainbow. And of course, it's not rendering because my cache is current again. Let me reset it. Might actually have a bug in this version. There you go. So that was a lovely surprise that was added in by the engineering team. I want that one in the PowerShell progress bar. So anybody does anything like that, let me know and I'll get you some kind of swag or something special on that one. I think some of our best features have actually been submitted by the community. We had a lot of challenges around debugging and getting logs, and the community added an argument to turn on the verbose logs and open up that directory. And we've had somebody from PowerShell community who has written a nice bit of a commandlet that will make it easier to go parse our logs. Verbose logging is very verbose. You're going to see all of the HTTP traffic going back and forth between the store or any REST source, as well as all of the SQL that is running through whenever we're running any of the commands. So I think I'm just about out of time here. I wanted to say thank you very much for everybody coming and attending this afternoon and being so welcoming in Prague. And a quick shout out to Gail for inviting me to come speak. This has been fantastic, and it was honestly a career highlight for me to get asked to come speak and present when it wasn't something being sponsored by my employer.